6 league-winning wide receivers that you need to be drafting going into the 2024 fantasy football season. We are excited to start bringing content on this channel. Guys, if you want to lock in, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. We're going to be bringing videos each and every week. So stay tuned. Let's get straight into my first wide receiver. My first wide receiver on this list, and a lot of people may disagree, and I love starting off with a little bit of controversy. Welcome back to the channel. Tank Dell. Yes, Tank Dell, as you can see here, wide receiver 26 on Underdog, my wide receiver 22, and I envision him moving up even higher in my rankings as we get closer and closer to the season. Now, let's start off where I know a lot of people are going to say, well, there's Nico Collins and Stefon Diggs, the newest addition to this offense. Let's start there with Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs is most likely a lot of arguments that people have been bringing is that Stefon Diggs, well, he's a diva. He demands 140 targets. I think Stefon Diggs is aware that this is not just he's just the main guy on this team. There's multiple weapons on this offense that he has to realize that he is going to be taking a step back. And we saw that in Buffalo. We saw in the second half of the season with Buffalo, after they fired Joe Brady, where they were spreading the ball out. Okay, keep in mind, they're spreading the ball out in Houston. We saw Stefon Diggs only had two double-digit fantasy points in the second half of that season after Week 10, after they fired Ken Dorsey, and then Joe Brady comes in. Coming into this offense, Stefon Diggs is not going to be demanding 140 targets. Stefon Diggs, in my opinion, is not even the wide receiver 2 on this offense. Nico Collins is, and then I see Tank Dell being the wide receiver 2. Now, obviously, things can change, but I feel really confident when I think of that. But not only that, let's talk about the value. Nico Collins, according to Underdog right now, wide receiver 15 as I'm recording this video. Stefon Diggs, wide receiver 18 as I'm recording this video. You know where Tank Dell is, as you can see on your screen? I mean, you don't have to know. You already know. Wide receiver 26. He is somebody who's a wide receiver 2 on this team that has the cheapest price to be acquiring at this very moment. Now, let's talk about the production that I'm going to be seeing. I'm projecting of him going into the 2024 season. Obviously, Tank Dell didn't necessarily break out, I would say, consistent basis until Week 9. But the first 2 games where we saw glimpses of Tank Dell was in Week 2 and Week 3, where he scores over 20 fantasy points. But let's look at that Week 9 start here. Obviously, after the bye week, you see the emergence of Tank Dell, and this is where he scores. And he's not only does he score nearly 30 fantasy points in two of the last 4 weeks before he gets injured, but the snap percentages: 85% snap share, 96% snap share, 76% snap share, 80% snap share. Not only that, weeks 9 to 12. He was averaging 23.7 fantasy points per game, 6 receptions, and 10.8 targets. I mean, if we were to extrapolate that, just for that span, if he would have played the full season and got that workload, he would have easily finished as a top 10 wide receiver. Now, let's take that away, because extrapolation is not perfect. What would he have done if he would have finished what he was doing just those last, 4 games that he missed? If he would have played weeks 9 to 17 before he broke his leg in week 13, what and where could have Tank Dell finish? He would have been a league winner. He would have been a Rashee Rice, a Jaden Reed. The list goes on the second half league winners that we saw this year. He would have been on that list of somebody that would have broken down. And there's no doubt in my mind that CJ Stroud is going to spread this ball around with an elite quarterback play that Tank Dell has, which is absolutely phenomenal here. And this is why Tank Dell is my first league-winning wide receiver that you need to draft. My second league-winning wide receiver, I bought this guy all over Dynasty. And I'm bringing him here in the redraft channel, which is exciting. And I think a lot of people would agree with me. Drizzy Drake Rogers. Drake London is somebody that we are all going to be drafting. He is going to be a league winner. I'm really hoping and believing now with Kirk Cousins. And I don't want to go too much into my take, but obviously wide receiver 10 on Underdog. He's also my wide receiver 10 in the Flock fantasy community. The past 2 years hasn't been the best for him, averaging 10.5 fantasy points in 2022, and in 2023, 10.9 fantasy points. And the quarterback play has been abysmal. Okay, Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ritter, Taylor Heineke for the past 2 years. Now insert Kirk Cousins, a fantasy machine, not only for himself, but someone that has been producing fantasy relevant wide receivers as Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, throw in TJ Hawkinson in there. The list goes on. When he was back in Washington, now he's under center with Drake London, who is clearly the number one wide receiver and the number one, I wouldn't say the number one weapon. I would say Bijan Robinson, the number one weapon, but the number one wide receiver in this room, especially specifically for Kirk Cousins. Now, to talk that up even more, let's talk about what's happening in this offense, right? Because if you're maybe new to fantasy, or maybe you're saying, okay, what has changed? You haven't really been keeping up with the Atlanta Falcons. They do hire a new head coach in Raheem Morris. They bring in Zach Robinson, was the offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams, and he is going to be calling the plays. What do we see this past year with the Los Angeles Rams and what they were doing? Okay, I mean, they were a top 10 in points per game when it came down in the NFL. Okay, you can see that here on your screen. Top 10, number 9 across the NFL in 2023. The Atlanta Falcons for the past 2 years have been the bottom in passing attempts in the past 2 years in 2022 and in 2023. You can see here in 2022, they were second to last in pass attempts, just ahead of the Chicago Bears. In 2023, they were 8th, bottom 10th in the league in passing attempts. Now insert Kirk Cousins. Now insert Zach Robinson, who's a new offensive coordinator, a high-powered offense. This is huge for someone like a Drake London, and not even Drake London. Maybe Kyle Pitts is somebody that I'm going to be bringing in the future in fantasy football as well. Wide receiver 10, this is a guy that's going to be going early, or I would say early second round, maybe even as we get closer into the season, he could easily be a late first round wide receiver, and Drake London is my next league winning wide receiver. All right, going into my next player on this list, going to my beloved New York Football Giants. My first take on this guy, which I'm excited for, Malik Nabers, wide receiver 20 on Underdog, my wide receiver 18, another guy I can easily see move up in my fantasy football rankings as we get closer into the season. Now let's talk about this offense, okay? Because I know a lot of people are concerned with the quarterback play. And let's start there. With the quarterback play in Daniel Jones, we know that we're not necessarily sure if he's going to be starting week 1. But we do have Drew Lock, who can easily come in and just be something for a little bit. Now, the quarterback play is not something we can be confident in, whether it's Daniel Jones or Drew Lock. But what we can be confident in is the talent and the projected targets that Malik Nabers is going to potentially be getting. Why? Because who else is on the team? As much as I love my Giants, I can tell you right now, there's no one that is a threat to Malik Nabers. Jalen Hyatt, a field stretcher. Wan'Dale Robinson, a slot wide receiver. We have Isaiah Hodgins, who's off the street. Allen Robinson, who was off the street. Darius Slayton, who, hey, he's had a nice little stint there. But what's exciting about this is that let's go back a couple years where Daniel Jones led this team to a playoff run. You know who was a leading wide receiver outside of Saquon Barkley in that offense that year? He led this team in targets in the wide receiver position. This is absolutely absurd, and it's Richie James. Richie James led this team in targets the year we went to the playoffs in 2022, and we beat the Minnesota Vikings. Remember that? Obviously, Daniel Jones was dueling up. You can't not say that he wasn't dueling up, and maybe he had one of his best games of his career. But now insert Malik Nabers with Brian Daboll, who, once again, was on the team where they traded for Stephon Diggs. And what happened to Stephon Diggs? He was demanded 140 plus targets. Not saying in year 1 he's going to get 140 plus targets, but I do feel really confident that he's going to be easily getting 100 to 110 plus targets coming into his rookie year. And at the price that he's at right now, with my projections of him finishing as a top 15 wide receiver 20 is a phenomenal price for Malik Nabers. All right, my fourth wide receiver on this list, staying in New York, going across the street, Garrett Wilson for the New York Jets. Wide receiver 8 in the fantasy community on Underdog specifically. My wide receiver 8 as well. And look, we have to understand that Garrett Wilson not only hasn't broken out yet, but is still a top 10 wide receiver in the league with him being very inconsistent. And this is the year for it. It was the year last year and Aaron Rodgers went down. But let me tell you why it is the year. Okay. Even though Garrett Wilson has been in QB purgatory for the past 2 years with Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, Mike Wright, Chris Streveler, right? Yeah, I mean, Trevor Siemian, Tim Boyle. I mean, it's been terrible. He's been playing with 5 different quarterbacks for the past 2 years, 6 if you want to include Aaron Rodgers in those first 4 snaps. But the guy demands targets, which is what's exciting here. You can see on your screen the past 2 years. In 2022, 139 targets. In 2023, 163 targets. Now, he doesn't have the fantasy points per game, but just imagine that with a competent quarterback. This is a guy that played with 6 different quarterbacks in the past 2 years, and each and every one of those quarterbacks still threw him the ball. Insert Aaron Rodgers. Insert a Hall of Fame quarterback, insert a Super Bowl quarterback, insert a quarterback that has produced multiple fantasy relevant wide receivers each and every year in his career. Think about that hype that we were getting last year. I think it's a whole new, it's reflamed, it's reignited. Okay. Garrett Wilson coming in with one of the best quarterbacks in Aaron Rodgers is easily going to be taking over this league and can easily finish as a top 5 wide receiver. Yes, top 5 wide receiver in the league coming into at the end of 2024. And Garrett Wilson is another guy I can easily see rising up my rankings, which is why he is my next league winner. Before I get into my next player, if you love fantasy football, if you love indulging yourself in drafts specifically and maybe winning some money, go to underdog.com, use our promo code LAND. You can see here, get 50% deposit match up to $250, which is extremely exciting. Not only can you draft, you can potentially win some money at the end of the season as well. And we're going to be doing a lot of underdog stuff as we get closer into the season. We appreciate each and every one of you. Make sure you use promo code LAND. And going into my next player is George Pickens. According to Underdog, wide receiver 28, my wide receiver 25 in my rankings here. And let's look at what happened this offseason so far for the Pittsburgh Steelers and George Pickens. They traded away Deontay Johnson, who a guy that was demanding targets essentially his whole career for this team. Had the opportunity to draft a wide receiver 1 in this draft class, who was stacked. You could have got Brian Thomas Jr., Xavier Worthy, Lam McConkey. All those guys could have been picks for the Pittsburgh Steelers, which speaks volume that they didn't, and they stuck with George Pickens. Okay, they do draft another wide receiver in the 3rd round, and Roman Wilson, which is great, a good wide receiver too, but it speaks tremendous volumes on how much they believe in what they see in George Pickens going into 2024 season. Let's look at this quarterback situation, another quarterback carousel that we see here on this take. Terrible quarterback situation this past year. But what's exciting is that they're no longer on the team. Kenny Pickett, terrible, now with the Eagles. Mason Rudolph, terrible, now with the Titans. Mitch Trubisky, terrible, now with the Bills. Goodbye. Now you have insert Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. Russell Wilson, yes, he has a history of producing fantasy relevant wide receivers, not as of recent, but it's interesting what he could potentially produce as we saw this past year. Courtland Sutton averaging 11.9 fantasy points per game, tied 4th in touchdowns amongst wide receivers, which is exciting. I'm not saying that Courtland Sutton or George Pickens is going to be this guy, but I think George Pickens has a higher ceiling than Courtland Sutton. And obviously we saw Justin Fields actually, he kind of did produce DJ Moore to have his highest fantasy football season yet as wide receiver 6, averaging 16.9 fantasy points per game. I don't want to say they Fields produced DJ Moore. I think they really helped out each other is essentially what I'm trying to say. And Pickens could be up for a phenomenal fantasy football season, as we saw once again in that QB purgatory. And look what he did with those rotations of quarterback. 63 receptions, over 100 targets, 1,100 yards, 5 touchdowns, 12.3 fantasy points per game. Can George Pickens take his game to the next level? There's no doubt about it. And the price that you're getting George Pickens at right now, I do believe is a pretty affordable price, maybe to be your wide receiver 3, maybe even a low-end wide receiver 2 as wide receiver 28 on Underdog. And once again, as we hear more of this chemistry build up here with Russell Wilson, even if Russell Wilson doesn't play the full season, at least you have Justin Fields, where we saw the consistency all of last season with DJ Moore. All right, one of my favorite wide receivers in the community, Jayden Reed, an underdog wide receiver 33 in my rankings, wide receiver 29, and he was one of the best league winners in the second half of the season last year. We saw what he did with Jordan Love and the emergence of him, and I think that's what's exciting. Let's start there at the quarterback position. We have to understand that Jordan Love now kind of hits this upper echelons the way he performed all of the second half of the season. Let's just start off in the most recent thing of how he beat the Dallas Cowboys, one of the best defense, one of the best offense in the playoffs, and goes to the next level. I mean, that alone was a solidifying game for Jordan Love and where his ceiling could potentially be for this offense. He has a top 10 dynasty, not only dynasty, but a top 10 fantasy quarterback going into the 2024 season. And Jayden Reed with the draft capital, and we've seen the hit rate for round 2 wide receivers be successful in the fantasy community, specifically in their first year. We saw Jayden Reed finish as a top 25 wide receiver in the fantasy community last year, averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game, nearly breaking 800 yards and 100 targets. What's exciting about Jayden Reed is how creative they use him. They use him on jet sweeps, right? Quick slants, screens, and so on and so forth. Not only on the goal line, but any parts of the field, which is exciting for Jayden Reed. And once again, we saw the second half of the season where he was a league winner, where he was averaging literally after the bye week, 15.4 fantasy points per game. Okay, just over 5 targets with just over 5 targets, averaging 6 targets per game. And I can easily see that increase as the season comes together. Now you're probably saying, what about Christian Watson? I love Christian Watson coming into the season as well. Whether Jayden Reed is wide receiver 2 or whether Jayden Reed is wide receiver 1, we all know what his floor is currently, which is exciting, and now only his ceiling can get even higher. And that's what's exciting about coming into this season. Let me just keep this in mind. Christian Watson, wide receiver 46. So a lot of people are believing in Jayden Reed a little bit more. So in the community, he's the wide receiver 1. But I think in the Green Bay Packers' eyes, he's the wide receiver 2. And if Christian Watson can't stay on the field, Jayden Reed is easily the wide receiver 1 on this offense. Jayden Reed, George Pickens, Malik Neighbors, Garrett Wilson, Tank Dell, and Drizzy Drake Rogers, my 6 league-winning wide receivers that you need to be drafting going into the 2024 fantasy football season. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. And before I let you go, flockfantasy.com/land. Use that promo code LAND. Get 30% off at sign up. Not only do you get everything that you see here on your screen, but you get so much more personalized DM, not only in the off season, but in season. You want a personalized DM on who you should be starting, who should be sitting. Should you make these trades in these during the season? Sign up at flockfantasy.com, get 30% off at sign up, and you get all the perks that you see on your screen. And once again, guys, it's all love.
Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy, even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.